Welcome to the Joy Lab podcast, where we help you uncover and foster your most joyful self. Your hosts, Dr. Henry Emmons and Dr. Amy Prasek, bring you the ideal mix of soulful and scientifically sound tools to spark your joy, even when it feels dark. When you're ready to experiment with more joy, combine this podcast with the full Joy Lab program over at joylab.coach.
Hello, I'm Henry Emmons.
And I'm Amy Prasek. So welcome to Joy Lab, where we infuse science with soul to help you uncover joy. So to do that, we focus on creating positive emotions and inner states that become the building blocks for a joyful life. So the element for this episode is compassion. And man, do we need it right now, I think. But compassion can be really misunderstood and is sort of confusing at times. So we hope to make it clearer and make compassion more accessible and doable. All right, so in that spirit, let's start with a quote from the Dalai Lama. He said, "My religion is very simple. My religion is kindness."
I love that. You know, compassion is kindness. It's kindness in response to suffering. I think it's really that simple, and it is immensely powerful, not just for those who we're showing compassion toward, but also for ourselves. So I'd like to open with a story. This is a teaching story that I think adds a really nice image for what compassion can do for us when we take the time to cultivate it. So picture a beautiful lake. It's a mountain lake surrounded by, kind of high mountain peaks. And right next to that lake is sitting an elderly sage, a wise person who just is there, and people around the area know about this sage, and they go to seek wisdom. So a young man who's a philosopher and a seeker is traveling to visit this sage and get some advice because he's wondering about how to understand compassion. So he arrives at the lake, he sits down next to the teacher and says, "Can you teach me about compassion?" And so the teacher just asks a little kind of opening question, "Well, tell me how you understand it." And so the young seeker goes into this long kind of intellectual explanation. And as he finishes, the sage takes out a bag that has in it a very bitter herb that everyone in that era and that region knows about, and they know how bitter it is. And so the wise person takes a spoonful of this bitter herb and puts it into a cup and fills the cup with water from the lake, and then stirs it up and hands it to the young man to drink. Wanting to be a good student, he goes ahead and drinks it, even though he knows how terrible it's going to taste. And sure enough, it's so bad, he just retches and has to spit it out. And then without a word, the teacher takes another spoonful of this herb, reaches over and pours it into the lake, and then stirs it up, and then dips his cup into the lake and hands it to the young man, who knows immediately that he won't even be able to detect any taste of this herb. And so he drinks the water, and it's pure, and it's flavorful, and there's no bitterness in it. And I think that this is a really great metaphor for pain and suffering, which we all experience and none of us can escape. But what we can do is to build a larger container to hold it in. We can do that by cultivating a good heart. How do we cultivate a good heart? We open ourselves up again and again, no matter what happens. Opening and then creating genuine connections.
I love that idea of building a larger container. I love how hands-on it is, right? It sort of gets us out of that feeling of helplessness. And what's great is that we're wired to do that, right? To build up our compassion muscles and to receive compassion. So I'm hoping, and I'm thinking at this point, it might be helpful to take a quick detour over to the biology of compassion to sort of really grasp this idea of being wired for this and how practicing it is so healing. So we'll look to the usual method for brain imaging studies where participants are shown pictures of someone suffering. And then the researchers watch with whatever brain imaging tool they're using. They watch what areas of the brain sort of light up. So an area that does light up in response to these pictures of people suffering as participants are looking at them is actually the amygdala. You've probably heard of it. And we can think of it as part of the brain's threat detection system, among other roles. So when someone's hurt or suffering and you need to check your surroundings, right, your stress response gets activated and you need to consider whether the suffering is coming to you. And we then have activation as well in areas associated with empathy. So these same areas light up when you're in pain as well. It's like an empathy alarm goes off. Right? I see your pain. I understand it. I can even sort of feel it. This is obviously all happening rapidly, but another area that sort of begins to warm up its engine at this time. Now, this same area lights up when we receive rewards or experience pleasure. So now it's as if during this moment of empathy, we're given a bit of positive reward feedback to start the calming of the stress response, to calm the heart rate, and start priming us to approach the person suffering rather than fight, flight, rather than running away. And so compassion is sort of whispering at this point is kind of how I like to see it, but it's about to shout. And this happens when a really old region of located in the midbrain associated with nurturing is activated. This region is full of oxytocin receptors, which maybe some of you know, or is sort of called the love hormone. But in this context, oxytocin really helps prompt caregiving behaviors. Now, of course, the science is still emerging, and these are best interpretations, and we really don't understand a whole lot about the brain. But to sum it up, it really does seem that when we see or hear about suffering, we're wired to detect it. Like in the most ancient part of our human operating system, we're wired to feel the stress of it and then to empathize with it. We're then prompted to act with compassion. And when we do, even with just a compassionate thought, we're rewarded. So we're moved out of fight, flight, eased into a rest and digest process, and we get a flood of reward and pleasure chemicals. And this experience is often called the helper's high for a reason. It feels really good. But I think, what's overlooked here as I just sort of skate through this biology is that space between detection and action. It can be hard to make that jump sometimes, right? And just because something is sort of priming us chemically doesn't mean that we're actually going to take action. We need some modeling. We need training to move more easily and consistently into compassionate action. And now we've talked in some past episodes about research out of Dr. Davidson's lab, the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. I think that's what it's called. They're essentially finding with all of these brain imaging studies really how plastic our brain is, but particularly when it comes to these positive states that we talk about here at Joy Lab. And we covered neuroplasticity a bit in episode 2, but the point is that we can grow these states by practicing them and bring them more fully into our lives. And I love this conclusion from one of the lab's studies on compassion training. The researchers said, positive emotions, such as loving kindness and compassion, can be learned in the same way as playing a musical instrument or being proficient in a sport.
Wow, I just think that's remarkable. It's like becoming a great athlete. It's something we can train ourselves to get better at through practice. So we might ask, why bother practicing compassion? Why would we want to be a great compassion athlete? Because feeling open and at the same time being filled with loving kindness is one of the richest and most joyful experiences that we humans can have. And I think it's pretty easy to understand this, that it can feel so much better to be in that state than to be caught up in our own little world with our own personal list of concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. We in episode 4, we talked about how practicing awe can lead to a shifted focus on the small self, which is like that healthy, true perspective that we're a small part of something much bigger. And compassion practices are associated with that same shift. And, the helper's high feels really great, right? I've heard it compared to the runner's high, but like you cannot get me to go for a run unless you're chasing me. And even then, and maybe others can relate here, I will hide or play dead. I will prefer that. So, the helper's high, that's what I'm jamming on. No runner's high.
So compassion is not just something that we do for others, because having more compassion is really good for ourselves. And really, this is one of our core principles at Joy Lab, that whenever we do something good for ourselves, we also do it for others, and vice versa. So let's dig a little deeper into what science tells us about the benefits of cultivating compassion. So what else do you have for us, Amy?
Yeah, there's a lot, actually. But I'm kind of obsessed right now with the show Ted Lasso, particularly how they dig into mental health. So sports psychology has sort of been on my mind. But this research really relates to all of us. So first, back to Ted Lasso, and I promise I'll tie it into some research. Okay, so in this episode recently called Man City, which is probably related to the Manchester name, but I'm going to say that that title plays more on the common beliefs that many of us have, maybe particularly men, have about displaying and receiving compassion. Sort of this false belief that compassion is weakness. I'm going to try not to spoil any plot lines, but here's what happened in this episode. So Jamie Tart, the superstar player who's kind of a jackass, is in the locker room after a big loss, right? And his dad comes in, who he has a really tough relationship with. And he comes in, he just starts berating Jamie and bullying him in front of all of his teammates. It was really hard to watch. And so after just standing there and taking this all in, Jamie punches his dad. And his dad then, gets pulled out of the locker room after the punch. And Jamie is just standing there, like paralyzed by the experience. And the fact that his teammates and coaches just saw all of it. And so one of those coaches, Roy Kent, who is this tough, grunty, like no emotion guy who really dislikes Jamie, he takes all of this in. And then without saying a word, he like aggressively races over to Jamie. And I swear he was going to punch him. But instead, he envelops Jamie in this big hug and just holds him silently. And so held in Roy's embrace, Jamie begins to just break down, like sobbing. And you could feel, or I could feel, I think other people, so I went to Twitter, lots of tears, that this moment, when both of these humans put aside their masks and armor, right, you saw them open up to an act of compassion, the giving and the receiving of it. It was so good. All right, so here's the research I'll tie in. There's this really great study out of Berkeley that found that NBA teams who had more trusting touch behaviors early in the season, like that hug from Roy Kent, those teams had better records at the end of the season compared to teams with less trusting touch. Isn't that wild? Right? No extra training, no berating players, just hugs and touches that communicated a message of, I'm so proud of you. That was awesome. Great job. And I think key here, most importantly, this stuff works off the pitch. I think it's called in football, soccer, and off the court.
Yeah. We so need it to work off the court, don't we? I just can't help but think about some of the events that are shaking our world up right now, and how much of a difference it might make if we could somehow respond with greater compassion. And I also just wonder, or can't help but notice, how these current events seem to be testing the limits of our ability to be compassionate toward one another.
Yeah, I'm going to imagine that there are like some serious head nods listening to that right now, probably thinking about this flippin' pandemic, right? Trying not to swear here, but there's been a lot of coverage lately on what, nurses and doctors are experiencing right now. They were running on adrenaline for the first year, but now their tanks are empty. And I know, pretty sure here, I could not do it. I'd be running on anger and resentment and making mistakes left and right.
I know. Even before COVID, there has been a trend that's really been concerning about burnout in the health professions. And of course, it can only be worsened by all the strains that the pandemic has placed on our system. One of the most common terms you hear about in terms of burnout among health professionals and others is compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue, as if, we get worn down by being compassionate or caring about others. And, really, if you read a description of burnout, it sounds very close to what we think of as depression. And I just wonder sometimes if they're just different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, burnout is depression. I think most of us are tight with both sides of that coin right now. And as you kind of said, Henry, I don't think it's just a problem with practitioners. So many of us took on more caregiving during this pandemic and still are. We had to hold a lot of daily risk. We lost jobs, friends, or family members. We heard all of these devastating stories and watched so many sad videos full of suffering. And when we let all of this stuff in, it pings those areas I talked about earlier in the brain, right? Threat detection, stress response, empathy, again and again on loop. And when we don't or aren't able to calm our system with caregiving behaviors or even like just a compassionate thought, then we're in this chronic state of stress. And I think that cycle alone can lead to burnout, depression, compassion fatigue, like whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Maybe we all have some compassion fatigue right now. But I do sometimes wonder if we misunderstand compassion a little bit, because we often do think of it as suffering with another or carrying their burden with them or just feeling badly when someone else is feeling badly. And all of that can get a little heavy. And sometimes there's even a sense of responsibility or guilt thrown in, and all of this is potentially depleting. Now, I know this is a struggle right now for a lot of nurses and physicians, especially early in one's career. But I want to share a story I heard from a nurse a while back who was early in her career, because I think it gives us a little different sense of what genuine compassion might look like. So this nurse was really young. I think she was in her first year or two of practice, and at the time this happened, and she was working on an acute care hospital ward. And on this ward, there was an older woman who was dying. She had terminal cancer, I believe. And everybody knew she was dying, including her family and the physicians and nurses, but nobody had talked to her, to the patient, about this. So this young nurse was on duty that evening and, was a little bit reluctant almost, or felt a little awkward going into this woman's room, but she did, of course. And while she was in there doing some work, the charge nurse came into the room. And as she did, the sick woman said to her, "Am I dying?" Just a straightforward question. Am I dying? And rather than denying it or refusing to talk about it or trying to fix anything, the head nurse simply sat down on her bedside, took her hand, looked her in the eye and said, "Are you scared?" And that simple question opened this woman up, and she talked about, yes, I am scared, and all the things she was feeling and people she was going to miss, and she knew she was dying too, but she so needed to talk about it. And the nurse who was just starting her career, when I met her, she was actually late in her career, and she shared that story as something that really profoundly affected her and changed her entire career after that. It just really showed her how different one can be in terms of being with and someone suffering and just being a compassionate presence for them.
That story is such a great example of like how simple an act of compassion can be, right? It doesn't have to be depleting. And there's a great study actually out of Johns Hopkins with a group of patients with cancer. And they found that, right, no big surprise here, that compassionate care significantly improved anxiety levels for patients. But here's the surprise. The compassionate care intervention that they were testing with patients took 40 seconds for practitioners to complete. 40 seconds. And there's a bunch of other studies that find significant positive impacts with interventions less than 1 minute. So this is something that really impacted me because I can get stuck in this paralysis of thinking. I think this is pretty common, that if I can't do much, then why do anything at all? But it's not true. I have to remember that. Just a tiny act, 40 seconds, maybe once a day, once a week, starting. At the very least, it'll calm my nervous system. And what we know as well about the upward spiral and how that works, the thing we talk about here a lot at Joy Lab, a tiny act can create positive momentum for more. All right, so there's like one common obstacle to compassion that I just shared, but there are more, obviously. And we usually dig into these obstacles with each of our elements. They stem from cognitive science, especially around the cognitive distortions, sort of the errors of thinking that get in the way of being more joyful. So Henry, this is your expertise here, along with many other things, but can you dig into those more, like the big distortions or obstacles that trip us up when it comes to compassion?
Sure. So there are two common mistakes in thinking that we make, and they're called personalization and blaming. And I think most of us know intellectually what those words mean. When we personalize, we attach a specific meaning or intent to someone, usually in a negative way. For example, we might judge someone's opinions as being wrong or their actions as being foolish. And when we do that, it becomes a lot easier to attack them, even if we only do that in our minds. And it makes it much less likely that we will respond to them with compassion. So blaming is one means of attack. And unfortunately, I think we are seeing this just running rampant today.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of research on this as well as social media, right? And how folks say terrible things online that they never say to someone in person, right? But it's just a bunch of avatars and like distance. So you can't really see the other person. It's much easier to blame and attack.
Right. So, one very current example, although it's a controversial one, is this question of whether or not to get vaccinated for COVID. So we don't really need to debate the merits of that right now, but I think it's easy to see how people on either side of this issue can get easily caught up in personalizing and blaming. And when the rhetoric and the emotions get as heated as they are right now, I mean, compassion just isn't even part of the conversation. Would it make a difference in this case? I don't know. I can't say for sure, but I have to think that it would. I just want to believe that kindness and understanding are always the better responses for everybody involved, no matter how hard it might be to get there.
I like that. Kindness is always a better response. I think you really just summed up Charles Darwin's main thesis, right? Darwin didn't propose some macho conquer-all survival of the fittest BS, right? He actually wrote this: sympathy will have been increased through natural selection. For those communities which included the greatest number of sympathetic individuals, those communities would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. So Darwin's findings are something that sort of helped me remember that everyone on this whole planet is wired toward that. We need to feel compassion and we need to give it to survive and flourish. And you're wired for that. I'm wired for that. Even your uncle who keeps posting racist crap on Facebook is wired for that. Even your coworker who did or didn't get vaccinated is wired for that. And even in those situations where people do really terrible things, like murder, terrorism, hate crimes, maybe there are a few genetic anomalies, but these people, they're wired for compassion too. They are wired to need the nurturing of others and to provide it as well. So I just said all that, I think, right? But this is where I get really bristly with compassion. And even though I know, like deep in my bones, I know that having compassion for someone doesn't mean that they can't be held accountable for their actions. I know that. Those things are not mutually exclusive. Nonetheless, I have trouble seeing anything but evil sometimes, like name a terrible henchman from history, or even around this topic of vaccinations, like you noted, Henry. I have trouble moving from a place of compassion.
Right. And, I think for most of us mortals, this becomes very, very difficult to do. And so, I think it really helps to have models for this, to have sort of compassion superheroes that we can look at who give us an example of how we might do this. And one of those superheroes in my world is Thich Nhat Hanh, the beloved Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And I'm going to describe a story that he shared, which has some sensitive material in it. So just a warning about that to our listeners. Thich Nhat Hanh described this incident that he had heard about. He didn't witness it, but he had heard or read about it, where a group of refugees in a boat were attacked by pirates at sea, and there was a 12-year-old girl who was raped by one of the pirates, or maybe by several of them. And in response to that, she threw herself into the water and drowned. And hearing this, Thich Nhat Hanh was so upset that he was unable to sleep. And so he spent the night first thinking about this and then realizing, well, I'm a practitioner. I should practice this. And so he spent the night trying to meditate and practice compassion. So at first, he started by imagining what it might have been like to be the girl. But then he moved on to put himself into the shoes of the rapist. And he realized that if he had grown up impoverished and been lured into becoming a pirate, maybe just to feed his family, and then lived this harsh, violence-filled life, maybe he too could have been capable of such a thing. And this resulted in one of his most famous poems. He was a really good poet. The poem is called "Please Call Me by My True Names." And I'd like to share just a couple of stanzas. I am the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am also the pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. Please call me by my true names, so I can hear all my cries and laughter at once, so I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names, so I can wake up and the door of my heart could be left open, the door of compassion. So we may feel as if we want to close up when we face the immensity of the pain and suffering that's either inside of us or around us. But compassion offers us a different choice. It is completely natural, without any need to think about it, just to open up to the pain and allow ourselves to feel the sense of grief or loss or suffering, to feel it, but not to become overwhelmed by it. With genuine compassion, there is an acknowledgement. This is how things are. This is what happened. It doesn't mean that we need to fix it. We don't have to try to make someone feel better. Now, that might happen, but first, we are there to really be with what is. As Thich Nhat Hanh said, to listen with only one purpose, to help him or her to empty their heart. The paradox is, as you allow another to empty their heart, you fill up your own.
Yeah, let's fill up. We can build that bigger container by giving out compassion and also letting more compassion in. We need it. And I'll say it again, we are wired for it. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this Joy Lab podcast. We really hope you'll join us over at the Joy Lab program, where we build on elements like compassion to cultivate a more joyful life.
Thank you for listening to the Joy Lab podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, visit joylab.coach to subscribe for your monthly infusion of joy and to learn more about the full Joy Lab program. Be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.